built, you have your repeating pattern design ready to go, and now we're ready to transfer the grid onto your coil pot so you can get the carvings completed. So if you don't have a design ready, this is where you're going to want to start, because you're not going to want to go straight into your onto your clay, because if you mess up, then it's going to cause all these other problems. So if you do have your pattern kind of worked out, maybe you need to do some fine tuning, maybe fix a few things here and there, maybe stretch some shapes out, fix some lines, all of that stuff. If you do want to do that, then that's what you're going to want to do first before you go to your grid and start carving. So make sure this is finished and in tip-top shape before we go to the next step. I'm going to show you how to put a grid on my coil pot with watercolor, but you can just do the lines that I'm going to show you, you can just do it with a pencil. If you have watercolor, even better, but it's not a necessary supply. A pencil or a pen will work great. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So the first thing that you need for the transfer of your grid is just a regular piece of paper. So it doesn't have to be plain, it can be whatever. It just needs to be something that you can turn into a square. So in order to get my square piece of paper, I'm just going to fold it over to one edge, make sure that the corner is lined up, and then I'm going to cut this piece off. So I'm going to cut this. And now we have a square piece of paper. Once you have that finished, now you have to decide if you want your coil pot to have 4 separate areas where you're going to apply the grid, or if you want 8. I'm only going to do it 4 times because the coil pot that I made is it's kind of small. So for the size that you guys probably have, if you followed my lead with the bowls, 4 quadrants is going to be good. But if you did want to want 8 sections, so the pattern repeating 8 times, just fold this again and then you would have 8 sections. Now you guys don't have to do this particular step because you'll be able to see your lines on your paper. But for the video, I want you to be able to see this really well. So that's why I'm drawing my lines on here with a pen. So there you go. So now you can see it really good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my coil pot. And remember, this should be at the leather hard stage. And I'm going to put this right on top of my paper, and I can see where these lines are now. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to get a pen or a pencil, and I'm going to mark on my pot where that line is. And I'm going to do this all the way around. So I'm just taking my pen and I'm lining it up with the line on the paper. And then I'm marking it on my pot. So now I've got a mark on my coil pot. And you should have 4 marks. So if you feel like you can't see it, then line them back up and redo that. So at this point, I don't need this piece of paper anymore. That was just kind of a quick way to get the first segmented area on our coil pot. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to create our vertical lines and our horizontal lines. So that's what we'll do next. Okay, now like I said, I am going to be using watercolor so you can see where the lines are and see what I'm doing, but you can just do this with a pencil. So you're going to take your ruler, and I have my coil pot elevated on a turntable, but if you have it, it doesn't have to be a turntable, it can be anything. You could use your bowl, flip it over, and just set it on there, but you need it to be elevated so you can line up your ruler, and you could use like a paint stick, you could use a dowel rod, you can use anything that's straight, but the bottom of this needs to sit flat on the table of wherever it is you're working. So if you have this sitting on the table too, it gets a little bit tricky. So you need something with a flat surface that's a straight edge. So then I'm going to line it up with the mark that I made, and I'm going to put my pencil, or in my case, my paintbrush, up against the ruler. So I'm letting the ruler do the work. My ruler is up against my pot, and then I'm going to just create a straight line going up my coil pot. And in your case, you'll probably just have a pencil line. But I didn't move this. I had it sitting flat against, so if you can imagine like this, I had it sitting flat against my ruler, and I just kept this, my writing utensil or my paintbrush or whatever it is you're using, keep it flat against this straight edge. In my case, it's a ruler, and you're just gonna go straight up, okay? So we're gonna do that again. I'm gonna find my marks, so my mark's right here. Some more paint on my brush. Line up my straight edge. Make sure your straight edge is straight too, because it might be, if it's not straight here, it's probably not gonna be straight here. Okay, it's flat against my straight edge surface, and go straight up all the way to the top of the pot. Whoops. And then I'm going to do that one last time. Okay. And now we have our grid evenly distributed around our coil pot. Now you'll notice that the lines start wider and they go in, but that's because it's following the shape or the contour of your actual coil pot. So that's normal. So don't get like in a frenzy thinking, oh, it's too skinny up there, it's not the same down here. That's perfectly fine. That's what you want. That's going to happen. Okay? So you can see I slipped a little bit right here. So I am actually going to fix that. I'm going to wipe it off with a sponge and I'm going to fix it. So that's the benefit of doing this in watercolor. If you mess up your grid, you can wipe it off. If you did it with a pencil and it left some real faint carving marks, you could probably smooth them in with a sponge. It would probably work. But if you carved really hard, then probably not. Lines to my grid on my pot, and they're equally distributed. So now what I want to do is I want to put my horizontal lines, and this is a little bit more tricky, but fortunately you guys are only going to have one band all the way around, so it's not like you have to make multiple lines unless you're going to repeat your pattern multiple times vertically. I'm only going to repeat my pattern just once going around the center. So I only need 3 lines right here. I'm going to establish my bottom line and my top line, and then I'm going to come in and I'm going to establish my middle line. Okay, so if you have access to a turntable, this is going to be a little bit easier because you can actually turn your pot. But if you don't, I'll show you a way to do that here in just a second. So I'm going to pick where I think I want my pattern, and I'm going to keep my hand still. I am not going to move it. I'm going to let the turntable do its work, but you do want to make sure that this is as centered as you can. So sometimes these turntables, they have rings on them, and so you can kind of line your coil pot up according to those rings. And I'm doing this in a different color so you can see it. So notice that my hand is staying still. It's not moving. I'm letting the turntable do the work. And my line met up perfectly at the end there. Now, if you don't have a turntable, it's a little bit trickier, but it is definitely still possible. But what you have to do is you have to push down on the pot as you turn it, because you don't want it, because if you just kind of loosey-goosey, you see how it's walking away from me? So you have to make sure that you're pushing down as you turn. And sometimes I even tell people if they can get somebody to help them, you know, maybe you just hold your hand still and concentrate on keeping your hand still, and you have somebody turn the pot for you. So you could do that. So at this point, I want my pattern to come down pretty far. So I'm going to pick a spot, and then I'm going to push down and turn. Now again, you guys will be doing this with either a pen or a pencil if you don't have watercolor. But notice that my hand that has the paintbrush is not moving. And there we go. We lined right back up with where we started. So at this point, I'm going to measure my distance from this red line to this red line, because I want to find the middle. I could probably eyeball it, but that could get a little bit tricky. So I should mention that I added a top red line and a bottom red line because I'm creating a border at the top and bottom of my middle repeating pattern design. So I went ahead and added one as a guide. But you might not have that on yours, and that's okay. If you don't, then you don't need to do that step that I just did. So I'm measuring my middle section so I know where the middle of my grid is. So I'm going to be at 1.5. So same process. I'll take it off of here for those of you that do not have a turntable. You can see this again. So keeping my hand steady, not moving it, pressing down on the pot and turning. If your pot moves a little bit, it's not going to be a huge deal. But if it moves a lot, that's where you're going to get into some problems. Okay, so this is my middle section for my repeating pattern, this is my border, and this is my border. At this point, now what I'm going to do is I want to find the middle section of my grid. So you can just kind of eyeball it if you want to, especially if you don't have like a flexible tape. That could get a little bit tricky, so this is a flexible tape, a seamstress tape really. But so my grid here, my sections are 3.5. So then my middle would be 1 3/8. So that's where I would mark it. And I'm actually going to use an additional color so you can see it on the video. And I don't need to make like a long line going from one end to the other. I'm just going to put it right in the middle there, just so I know that's the center of this quadrant. And there we go. My grid's ready to go. I'm ready to actually draw my pattern on here. Once I have it drawn on here, then I'll carve it. Now that we have our grid on our coil pot, we're ready to transfer our design that we came up with and carve it in. But we're going to start with just a regular number 2 pencil. So just to kind of further explain, I think it's kind of at this point makes sense, but I just want to clarify just a little bit. So on my drawing here, I went ahead and put the grid in red so you can see it. So the blue line on our coil pot is this line right here. So it's that dividing line that shows the segment. So this line equals the blue line. Then we have our center line right here, which is going right down the middle of our pattern. And then for me, I'm going to put a border at the top and the bottom of my repeating pattern. So that's what these 2 lines are. So top of the border, bottom of the border, this section here, and same on the bottom. Now you might not have a top and bottom section to your repeating pattern. You might only have this middle area, so then you wouldn't even have those sections on your coil pot. So you just might be right here. And if that is true, then your middle band for that pattern, it could be, you know, the entire belly of the coil pot if you wanted it to be, but I put mine right in the middle because I knew I was going to have a top and bottom border. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start transferring my repeating pattern onto my coil pot, and I'm going to reference this drawing as my guide. So that makes it just easier, and it's more cohesive, and it will help me get my pattern balanced out. Now, if you wanted to, you could go ahead and put your pattern on your coil pot with watercolor. That way, if you did mess up, you could just wipe it down and erase it. But you can do the same thing with this pencil, because we're not actually going to carve into our pot necessarily. We're just going to kind of sketch the pattern out. So if you do have something soft that you can put your coil pot on, that's a really good idea. It's not, I mean, your coil pot is at the leather hard stage, so it's not going to change its shape, but it just gives it a little bit more protection. But if you don't have that, it's okay. It's not a huge deal. So the other thing that is beneficial is if you do have a flexible tape, that will help you line up and get really straight edges if you want to, especially if you have a little bit of a wobbly hand. But if you don't have that either, it's okay. Just do the best that you can as you go through your pattern design. So I'm going to start with this diagonal line here. So I know that it goes in the middle. So I probably should have put my little green dash on the top and bottom, but that's okay. And I know that it comes to this point here. So I'm going to start there, and I'm not worried about an exact measurement. I'm just trying to get a straight edge. So whatever I do in one section, though, I want to make sure that I do it all the way around. So if I'm going to line this up at the bottom of my red line, I'm going to want to do that all the way around. Or I can line it up to the top of the red line. Either way, you just have to make that decision. So I think I'm going to go below the line, since that's what it looks like in my drawing. And then I'm just going to kind of find the middle of my blue line. And I'm going to very lightly draw that onto my pot with my pencil. So you probably can't really see it. It's really, really faint. And I'm going to do that all the way around my coil pot. And I'm going to start with the same line. I'm going to go ahead and just keep with this diagonal line until I've done it in every segment. And then I'll move on to a different section. time lapse in this video can be a little bit deceiving. The entire process of putting the repeating pattern onto the grid of the coil pot took about 25 minutes. So take your time, don't feel like you need to be in a rush for this process. You want to be as accurate as you possibly can. Refer to your repeating pattern grid that's on your paper and constantly compare it to the grid that is on your coil pot. If you do that, you'll have a pretty accurate repeating pattern design on your coil pot that will be ready to carve. As I continued transferring my pattern onto my coil pot, I did need to make a few adjustments in regards to measurement. So if you have to kind of freehand it a little bit, that's okay. Still try to get your spacing as accurate as you can. My pattern is transferred onto my coil pot, and some of the areas I just did in permanent marker so you could see it really well. I can see the pencil marks, but I don't think it'll show up too great in the video. So at this point, now I'm ready to actually go in and carve away the clay from the actual pot surface. It seems sort of strange, but I'm not going to go straight to a ceramic tool. Instead, I'm just going to use a number 2 pencil. I'm going to go right over my lines that are now on my pot, except this time I'm going to apply pressure so clay falls out of the surface of the actual coil pot. You know that your clay is ready at the leather hard stage when you carve into the coil pot and the clay just falls away. So if you can see, I've already done a little example here, but the clay does not stick to the surface. It just falls right off. That's what you want, and that's how you know that you're at the leather hard stage. I'm not worried about these little line marks. I'm going to go ahead and clean those up later once I have the pot all finished. So at this point, I'm going to go through and I'm just going to use, like I said, a regular number 2 pencil to create my lines and my carving. A great way to tell if your carving is actually working, just take your fingernail and just go across the surface of your pot. And if you feel a little embossment, a little indentation, then you know you have an adequate carving. Like I said, the crumbs should just be falling right off the surface of their pot. If they're sticking, then your clay is still too wet and you need to let it set out for a little while. Or you could use the heat gun or a hair dryer but be careful if you do that. Only do a few minutes at a time and check for dryness. I know some of you are thinking, why aren't we using an official ceramic loop tool to make our carvings? Well, you're used to using a pencil. You've been using a pencil probably before you ever even entered kindergarten. So your hand is naturally used to the position of holding this tool, in our case, a pencil. So it does a really good job at allowing you to create basically a guide for switching over to a loop tool if you have access to one. If you do not have access to a loop tool, then once you have your first initial path or carving created, then what you'll want to do is just go back through your carving that you've made 1 or 2 additional times, because we want to make sure that the carving is deep enough when you apply your glaze, it doesn't disappear. Something else should be noticed is my hand position. Notice how the heel of my hand is resting on the surface of the coil pot. This allows my hand to have a foundation, so it doesn't feel like I'm just drawing in the air. It keeps my hand and my pencil steady as I go over my pencil lines. At this point, if you have access to a loop tool, you're going to want to go back over your pencil lines and carve out some additional clay. The loop should be laying flat against the surface of the clay wall. Remember that the crumbs should be easily falling off the surface and not sticking. If you do not have access to a loop tool, it's not the end of the world. You can simply go back through your lines with your pencil and it will just, again, kind of do the same thing. It will just continuously, gradually take out more clay. You may have to apply just a little bit more pressure with a pencil, but at the end of the day, it's going to do the same thing that a loop tool would. I'm going to repeat this process 2 to 3 more times to ensure that my carvings are deep enough that my glaze doesn't cover it up. If you have access to a paintbrush, it's a really great tool that allows you to brush away those crumbs that are sitting down inside that carving. All you do is just simply brush them away and they just kind of fall off to the side. We're getting really close to being finished with our carving process. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to remove my grid that I created with the watercolor. This just allows me to see the carving really well. The other thing that the sponge will do is it will show me where I have shallow areas of the carving. So when you're sponging this, once you're finished, you're going to take a look at the lines. And if there's any areas that look like they're a little bit too shallow, where the glaze will probably cover it up, then you need to recarve that area. I'm usually in a pretty big habit of sponging the whole surface down and then doing an additional carve through the entire repeating pattern. And I usually do that twice. However, if your carving is deep enough to start with, you might be able to avoid that. So for example, the area where the two diamonds are in the middle, that area is appearing a little bit shallow and I'm afraid my glaze will fill it in. There's another section at the top where the line almost disappears. So I'm going to take my loop tool and I'm just going to go back through the entire pattern once more.